YouTube thing ready. Brokers, buying practices, and building dreams. This is Paul, Dr. Nacho Goodman, founder of Dental Nachos and Dentist Job Connect. I'm so thrilled to be talking to my friend, Kyle Francis. He's going to talk to you about all the things he does with the business of dentistry. He has been to Philadelphia and had our world-class nachos at Alves. Kyle, thanks for joining me. I love you just oriented our audience. It's kind of a day in the life of Kyle Francis, what you do with practices, helping people find jobs, stay sane, build their dreams. We'd love to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, maybe first things first. To my surprise, whenever I walked into Alves, coming from, Texas background, all that kind of stuff, I was like, okay, nachos out in Philly, I don't know. And it was legit. It was really, really good.
I'm glad we lived up to expectations.
It was really good. Okay, well, so in terms of, spending time, maybe I can tell you what I'm most passionate about. Making sure that doctors understand the equity that they have within their business and then how to best leverage it, right? And so whenever I think about the ways to best leverage it, that can be a myriad of different directions. Way one is going to be you have a practice and you want to own it for a really long time. That creates a really strong recurring cash flow and you continue on, and maybe you build that over the course of time. Maybe that's associates, maybe that's bringing on partners, maybe that's going out and buying additional practices and then being a multi-practice owner, right? Like somebody else that I know, right? And so that's one really great way of doing it. I mean, if you look at kind of the old school methodology, it's a great way of handling things. Another way is going to be, some people decide they don't really particularly want to be an owner, right? It's like, okay, then how do you best end up working on the right type of practice and the right type of you talk about dream building, and an associateship mindset, right? So we end up talking with folks about that. Final thing that we do is going to be, looking and seeing how private equity and leverage ends up working within a dental space as well. Dental is not the first industry to consolidate. It won't be the last either. So we're just kind of be midway through, which kind of just increases the option structure for most doctors out there.
I love that breakdown, really, really concise. And, I like those movies that start sometimes at the end and then go back to the beginning. So instead of starting with the dentist out of dental school, I know you and I know I'm a broker too, help dentists, buy and sell practices. LOI stands for letter of intent, but I want to talk about LOA, lack of awareness. So let's just talk about a 55-year-old dentist who's got a 6-operatory practice that brings in $1.7 million a year. And if they just came to you, Kyle, and said, what are my options? Even if you kind of reinforce what you say, talk to them in dental speak. You said, hey, Dr. Guac, it's a good name for a doctor. Here are some of your options, like a menu at Alves of how you can get to the next step in dentistry. Tell us what you talk to your potential clients about.
Man, that is such a great question. I guess our average client age is 41, right? And so, and if I look at the average practice size that we work with, it's going to be somewhere in like the $2 million range. So that actually just fits very nicely for the type of work that we end up doing. We end up doing somewhere around 700 or so prospectuses a year for practices like this. And the reason being is that I have a really hard time saying, I know exactly what you should be doing until I've got a really great understanding of your business, Dr. Guac. But regardless, let's say that I've already got that done, right? So I've already got the analytics done. If I already have that done, and let's say that this person is bringing home, somewhere in the $800,000 range a year, right? And let's say that this person ends up having something like, call it $400,000 in EBITDA, right? And EBITDA is just a fancy way of talking about profit, right? So
tell me for a second. I was just talking. I always tell my wife, I don't interrupt. I interject with good ideas. You can use that at home. But just because I was just talking about this today, and I was listening to a great podcast that talked about seller discretionary earnings versus EBITDA. While they might be the same, just tell our audience, if they never heard of EBITDA, and they say people throw this term around a lot. You talked about $800,000, but then you said $400,000 EBITDA. Just kind of demystify that a little for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So seller's discretionary earnings is also it's a marketing term that brokers have used for a really long time. Really what it means is how much you take it home on a yearly basis. Right. Everybody runs their tax life differently. So some people end up taking a lot of that in W-2 compensation. Some people take a lot of that in net income distributions. Some people end up running a whole bunch of stuff through their practice from, a personal standpoint, right? And again, in order to standardize everything, we end up rolling all of that together and we say, hey, this is your total amount of take-home income, right? Early on in my career, I used to have this term called true take-home, right? That's kind of what this ends up looking like how much are you really getting at the end of the day? But that's way different than EBITDA, right? So EBITDA is going to be a fancy private equity term. It's a finance term. It stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. The easiest way of thinking about it is this. Let's say that doctor no longer wanted to be a practicing dentist and they wanted to just be an investor within their own business. They decided to say, hey, do you know what? I'm going to have a whole bunch of associates come in here, do all the work out of the practice, and I'm just going to sit back and see how much it'll spin off for me. That's EBITDA, right? So it's an investment term, and it wants to know how much is left over after all of those doctors are paid a fair salary to do the work out of the business.
I like that. I mean, the true take home is like, if Dr. Salsa replaces Dr. Guac, it's going to feel like Dr. Salsa makes $800,000 a year, but Dr. Salsa will take over the clinical, the business. They will basically swap themselves out. Someone buys it as an investment, they're going to pay somebody the $400,000 to do the dentistry, and their profit is $400,000. So really great breakdown. So now if we're back to Dr. Guac, he's saying, what can I do next, Kyle? I've heard DSOs buy practices. I heard DPOs buy practices. I heard groups buy practices. I heard just dentists who were like me 20 years ago buy practices. Right. Tell them about this choose your own adventure of the practice life.
Yeah, well, I really do kind of think it's kind of like that right now. We actually, we did a choose your own adventure book. I don't know if you remember that from whenever you were a kid, you know,
I did that.
Ways of thinking about that. And we did that for this purpose. But if I end up looking at the different choices that this person has, yes, could you sell it to an individual? Yeah, absolutely. No harm, no foul, right? If you just wanted to be exit stage left, right? You wanted to have that person come in, purchase the practice. There are plenty of financial institutions that will lever up and buy and sell that practice to that individual for, call it $1.3, $1.4 million, right? Depending on where you are in the country, that could be higher or lower, right? So if you're in the southern coast of California, that might be dollar on dollar revenue. If you're kind of from a small town in Kansas, like where I'm from, then maybe that's going to be 50% of revenue, but, you know, somewhere.
And I want to add in or interject that, you know, people say, I live in the city, and they go, Paul, you don't have a backyard. I go, yeah, what's the problem? I have no desire to mow grass, right? But other people go, I need a yard to sit outside. So in that scenario, as we walk people through this, that means that they're going to sell the practice and leave very soon. You know, maybe they stay for 3 to 6 months in some sort of grandfatherly role if it's a fee-for-service practice. But if you're listening as a seller, that means that you are required to remove yourself from this practice most of the time. When people say, yeah, but there's one dentist, I know this, it's a one dentist practice. When they loan this money to the new to the Dr. Salsa, they are expecting the Dr. Salsa, keeping with this food term, to consume the majority of the production. Am I right with that?
Couldn't agree anymore. Yeah, that's very good. Now, all of it has to do with profit margin, right? Yeah. So if the profit margin is high enough, maybe there's enough room for the two doctors to end up, you know, working together for a certain period of time. If you have 6 operatories, could you conceivably put 2 doctors in there, maybe staggering schedules, all that kind of stuff? Theoretically, yes. But overall, most of the time, yes, that is a one doctor practice that is going to be sold to another doctor. That person ends up having a short-term transition out, and then that single person will consume all of the rest of the production.
Yeah. So that's if you're following, you know, you could get $1.3, $1.4 million. You get this giant Happy Gilmore check. That's how I want my check. I want a giant one of those checks. And then you hang up your handpiece and you Uber off into the sunset. So then if Dr. Guy says, hey, Kyle, that sounds good to me, but what other options are out there? I've heard my friends say that they sell their practice, they stay on and work afterwards.
Sure.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So look, this is not a new transition type. This is actually called the Mercer style transition that has happened since the 1970s, right? So if you have a large enough practice or enough profit margin, then what you can do is you can sell off certain portions of your practice to an individual. I've been involved in a lot of these as well, right? And so this can work out nicely. Now, here's the thing. You do need time for this to occur, right? We said that this person happens to be 55 years old. We do have time, right, for this to occur. So maybe what you can do is sell off a third to the first person, right? Maybe that person isn't enormously fast in their overall production. So as they build up speed over the course of time, you take that $1.7 million practice to $2.1, $2.2 million. Maybe at that point, you end up bringing on another partner, right? So an old Mercer style transition requires time because of debt leverage. So that first note almost always has to be paid off before that second note is incorporated within the practice, or the doctor is going to have to take on the seller carried financed portion of that note because a bank doesn't want to take on multiple notes within a singular practice. easiest way of thinking about that is like a first and a second mortgage, right?
Gotcha.
So that's like laying on a second mortgage onto a practice, and most people don't want to be the second lien holder. So as long as you have time to incorporate something like that, that can typically be able to cash out a doctor something like dollar on dollar revenue instead of maybe 70 or 80% of revenue, right? So you end up growing it over the course of time. Each one of your percentages that you end up selling might be worth a little bit more. Just takes a little bit of time to accomplish. But again, if you have the time, effort, and energy to do it, it can work out nicely.
And I want to use this acronym. I use this for associateships. How to avoid WTF associateships, why these fail. Also, the other version of that for the multiple dentist incorporation, you have to avoid the WTF. You need to really make sure why these fit, because you really have to have the personality that's ready at the age of 56 or 51 to start incorporating other dentists into the ownership part of the table. And many dentists I know, not all, that sometimes is not a personality, flexibility, skill set that they have.
Oh man, that is so true, right? And so if I look at it from an associate's standpoint as well, the longer that associateship goes, the higher chance of failure it is. The worst stat in all of dentistry is going to be the success rate of associates over a 5-year time horizon, 20%. And that's just from private practice. That is a mess. And so the farther on you go without having people's money tied to their mind, the worse the likely outcome ends up being as well. So
now, Kyle, let's go. We're using the 80s themes. We saw each other at the DEO. I really enjoyed that presentation. I get, some people think DSOs are evil, like Skeletor from my favorite show, He-Man. Other people think they're the saviors of the industry. There's probably a truth inside of this middle, but let's just tell, we're talking about this one dentist, Dr. Guac. I had a practice for sale in the middle of Pennsylvania. We showed it to 6 private practice buyers. They all said, this is a great practice, but we do not want to move here. They sold to more of a DPO. We'll get to that in a second. But the DSO, people say, if I said, I heard about DSOs, Kyle, my practice is 1.7 million. How much can I get for it? And then also, what's going to be my requirements after selling most of the time?
Yep. Well, so a couple of things to think about here. So if I look at, DSO, DPO, IDSO, DMO, really, there's all of these different marketing terms, right? Yes. All these different marketing terms essentially are a mechanism. And that mechanism is essentially allowing private equity to invest within dentistry, right? And that might be a private equity fund, that might be a private individual, that might be a family fund. There's lots of different mechanisms to get there. But long story short, whenever I've bought practices, I've owned 25 myself, right? I'm not a dentist. And the reason I was able to do those, I put umbrellas over the top of each one of them. And that umbrella ended up siphoning up net income out of the dental practice, and then essentially allowed me to be an investor within it.
Gotcha.
So in a way, am I a private equity person? Not really, right? But that's the way that it's being done, just on a larger scale. So anyway, if you think about a DSO, I think they pretty much fall into 3 buckets. That first bucket is going to be if an individual wants to be out of there within, call it a 2 to 3 year time horizon, something like that. Sometimes it can be even shorter. Then what they may want to do is just go ahead and sell all of their equity to that DSO, and then essentially just continue to work with them over a certain time horizon. Now, maybe you want a little bit of equity within that vehicle. Maybe you end up wanting a little bit of an earn out or an earn up type of structure to make sure that, the costs end up working out. But long story short, if they do have $400,000 in EBITDA, my guess is going to be they'll probably transact that practice at something like, between $2 and $2.4 million if they have a good advisor, right?
And so basically, just in this story, which is that you're going to, I'll oversimplify it a little bit, but maybe you get $2.2 million, you work for 3 years, you get paid as an associate, you have some play nicely factors built into your contract, right? But in general, it's a cleanish way to get out of dentistry with a beginning, middle, and end to it. If after 3 years you love the DSO, they love you, maybe you keep going. If after 3 years you want to move across the country to a different climate, you can do that. But it is, I just want to highlight, since I am the dentist here. Maybe we'll get you to filling fantasy camp, Kyle. We can create like a module for you to try to be a dentist one time if you want. Like for those like those Tough Mudder courses.
Right.
When a dentist sells their practice to a DSO, that's not the end of them being inside of an operatory. And for some, that's very attractive. And for some, that's not attractive. And again, back to the personality fit, if you were the person who gets upset with blue pens being changed to black pens, or, your operating system being changed from Dentrix to Open Dental, if that infuriates you, those usually are not the personality fit to then be an employee for the next 3 years.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. And actually, really, when you think about it, it's very similar to the same type of person that would be okay with a partnership, right? So what you're trading in is going to be certainty for autonomy. And I don't mean clinical autonomy. I mean autonomy in decision making, right? So now you have a partner, right? And so if you have a partner, you trust that partner, you can have very, very nice decision making between the two of you. Now, if you have a partner and you don't trust that partner, or if you, whether that's an individual or a group, then suddenly that's going to cause friction, right? And so to your point, if they're worried about blue pens and black pens, then the chances that they're going to be able to be a good partner to whoever that is much lower.
And you're good. And the success of this is, hey, you get this 2.2 higher than the 1.4. You work for 3 years. Let's just say you make $350,000 a year working there. That's another $1 million. So now this entire transaction has brought you, without getting accountants involved, $3.2 million, where that transaction selling to a private practice dentist has brought you $1.4 million. So the total dollars, yes, you're working, are different. And also I want to share, and you do more brokering than I do, there's a lot of tragic and sad, sudden stories with dentists. And, if you have a sudden death, which I've dealt with personally and with clients, your practice value plummets immediately. And it doesn't.
It's 1% per working day.
Yeah, right. So it's not to guard against disaster, but it's saying if you're 59 years old and this was an investment that you want for your family, if you are not there working, it's very hard to sell it for anything close to what is done there. So that was a great breakdown. Now, you said there was 2 other types of DSOs.
Yeah, so 2 other buckets. Yeah. So one bucket, so just to recap, is going to be, let's say you sell all of your equity and essentially for the purpose of being out sooner rather than later, right? Sometimes that can be 3 months, sometimes that's 6 months, sometimes that's 2 or 3 years, kind of depending on the group. The next one is going to be, let's say instead, you end up going involved in what I would call like a joint venture type of deal. A joint venture type of deal is going to be very similar to a individual partnership. Let's say that you end up selling maybe a 60% stake or a 70% stake within the business. Now you're going to be selling that for a good multiple to start out with. Again, maybe on a $2.4 million valuation, you end up cashing out $1.6 million day one. Now, what that can allow for is what we would consider equity arbitrage, right? Which happens during a consolidation wave. That equity arbitrage essentially can be making that additional 40% of the practice way more valuable. And here's what I mean. The reason that banks don't want to lend much more than $1.6 to $1.8 million on a singular transition or on a singular transaction is because of what's called provider risk. Provider risk is where that bank says, okay, I'm going to bake this really big note on this person, but what happens if they get in a mountain biking accident? They're the ones left holding the bag, right? So really the DSOs and the DPOs and the DFOs, the IDSOs, whatever you want to call them, they ended up coming in and they say, hey, we're going to diversify this provider risk. So if something bad happens to one provider, it's not going to be terrible to this entire ecosystem, right? Which means you can lever up higher value. So once those groups come together, let's say there's now 50 practices, 100 providers within that environment, that group is now, instead of being worth maybe 6 times the profitability, it's now worth 12, 13, 14, 15 times the profitability. So the amount that you just kept is worth way more than what it was worth day one, right?
And these are real things. One of the things that how many transitions does PTS do a year, just for context?
We actually just did our 500th on Friday of last week, which I'm super proud about. Over the last 2 years, we did just over 200.
Yeah, so this is happening 100 times a year to you. I know it's not, and these are real things that are happening. So when someone's on a Facebook group or social media group saying this never happens, this happens where these dentists can sell part of their practice, stay along for this ride, and have a very happy financial ending. Is that accurate?
Very much so. It's actually kind of funny. So I already told you my least favorite stat in dentistry, which is a 20% success rate for associateships. My favorite 2 stats in dentistry are going to be the success rate of dental practices paying off their notes. Do you know that stat? Have you ever heard of it before? Yeah, so it's going to be 99.7%. So it's 0.3% default rate, right? So that's a not very risky investment, right? The only thing that kills dental practices are going to be the 5 Ds: death, disability, divorce, diagnosis, and drugs, right? Those are the only things that kill it. So if you end up aggregating a whole bunch of practices together, then essentially you're multiplying that effect over the course of time, right? And it's really, really, really hard to kill a DSO. So if you look at the success rate of a DSO going from one recap to the next recap, we're already 99% plus in effectiveness, right? And so, yes, are there bad stories out there? 100%. Are all investments, do all investments have risk? Yes, absolutely. What I would say is going to be an investment within a mutual fund of dental practices typically has less risk than a singular dental practice. That doesn't mean you should do it or not do it, by the way, because both of them are not very risky.
And I mean, that's where, I've been approached saying, I want you to be your practice, at the time of this recording, my brother and I own our practices 100%. We haven't sold any DSOs or DPOs, but I say, hey, Paul, we want you to be the flagship location for our thing. And that comes with potential reward, but potential risk too. And I just counsel my clients that whatever you get up front, make sure you're happy with getting this up front, because you just want to, you going along for this ride can be incredibly valuable to you, but you also have to stay along for the ride most of the time. And that's why it sounds like your younger clients are becoming more interested in this. It doesn't always seem, and you can challenge me, it's the right fit for a 68-year-old sometimes who wants to be done.
So I mean, if I look at most of the individual transactions that we do, they do skew older in total. I would also say it's probably part of the type of practices we end up working with. The vast majority of practices are kind of in the $1.5 million to $15 million range. So they've already developed a very, very nice ecosystem by themselves. And so if I look at it, so I mean, you said challenge you if I want. The only thing I might say is going to be, I hear CPAs talk about this a lot, that hey, make sure that the amount that you get day one, you're going to be happy with. What I would say is going to be, but what are you comparing it to? Right. And what are you comparing it to really is going to be, what is your practice going to do this next year? Right. It's not what your practice is going to do over the course of time. Right. Because if we're comparing apples to apples, what the practice is going to do from an income stream standpoint is pretty regular. Right. So if you have a $2 million practice and it's spinning off $1 million a year over the course of 5 years, you're going to get $5 million for it. Right. On the flip side, if we end up looking at it from a DSO, DPO, anything private equity invested, then we say, okay, you're going to get, $2 million up front, and you have $1 million rolling. That's going to end up growing on average 80% year on year, right? Which means that over the same time horizon, we end up getting 2 million plus the 5 million plus the amount that you're paid as a doctor, right? So
you would share that at this time in dentistry, the reality is there's really creative opportunities for entrepreneurial style dentists to be successful. With this,
we're just in a unique place. 10 years ago, these deals didn't exist. 7 years from now, they won't, right? Because we'll be consolidated. And that doesn't mean you should or shouldn't do it. I actually think a very reasonable person. I was actually just talking to a doctor down in the Woodlands right before we got on this in Texas. And we were talking about their very nice practice. And they were saying, well, I mean, one way of thinking about this is just being a ostrich, right? Sticking your head in the sand and letting consolidation happen. And quite frankly, that's true. Right? You can end up doing that and having a very, very nice outcome for yourself over the course of time, right? It doesn't necessitate that you should do it. What I think I'm passionate about is making sure you understand what the differences are.
Sharing the realities what you do. I won't keep you too much longer. A couple more questions. If you just had a few sentences to say to someone who came to you, what's the difference between a DSO and a DPO?
There's none.
What are some differences? Not
zero.
Much differences.
There's zero. That's marketing. And so essentially, if you look at this, we can call something a dental partnership organization. We call something a dental service organization. We can call something a dental support organization. An invisible DSO is one of the goofball things I've heard recently. So really think about it in these terms, right? If you have a partner, you want that partner to provide a certain amount of value to you, right? If that value is going to be in the mundane business tasks, well, then find somebody who's good at that. If that partner, you want them to be really good at the financial engineering and making sure the equity is going to be worthwhile in the long run, okay, well, let's find a partner that's good at that, right? If we look at it from a structural standpoint, there are different emotional things that I would consider different, right? So typically, if you look at the third bucket, which is what I would consider like an equity role means you're still selling 100% of your practice and you're trading it in for a mutual fund of dental practices, right? So you're taking 100% stake within yours and you're trading in for a 0.3% stake within all of the different groups or all the different practices within that organization. Now, emotionally, personally, I would have a really hard time with that, right? Because I know what my own two hands are doing in that own practice, right? And so it's really, really hard or nebulous to determine how your effectiveness is helping the overall organization, right? It's just a hard thing for my own brain to comprehend. So me personally, I'm probably more built for something like a JV style deal where you end up seeing your own work, right? You end up getting profit distributions on a yearly basis, and maybe you don't have as much upside, and maybe you're not quite as much risk diverse, right? But overall, it's more of a structural thing than anything. But
I'll give you a secret. You said a great thing there. I'll give you some good dentist speak for your dentist, because I'm the only dentist here. So dentists talk about the right treatment plan for the right person at the right time. So yours is the same, ours is the same way. The right transition for the right dentist at the right time.
Couldn't agree more.
Somebody who has inherited $10 million might think of differently about their practice transition than someone who has to make this their entire retirement without judgment, and I just think it's the right decision for the right person at the right time. A couple more things is, let's just for 1 second, I just got this message on Facebook now. Associate dentist making 200 grand a year in the Northeast, disgruntled with her job, wants to maybe start up a practice, buy a practice, do this. What's some Kyle Francis, just general tips on the next step for now, this part of the dental world, not the seller, the person who's trying to jump in from associate to owner? What are you saying?
Yeah, look, I would say this probably comes down to personality type more than anything else. Again, if you look at the way that I am built much more that I would like to buy a recurring cash flow stream. So I typically would like to purchase an existing practice and then make it my own. But I know a lot of folks out there that like to build what it is that they want to build their bones, right, and then fill in from there, right. And by the way, if you look at it from a risk perspective, neither one is risky, right? So essentially, if you have a good team behind you, right? So whether it's a good equipment supplier, a good consultant, a good accountant, a good attorney, right? All those different folks that'll help you in making these decisions, and making sure that, we don't overbuild, right? We don't want to make a Taj Mahal of dentistry before you see patient one, right? I remember that Bank of America used to be able to give $500,000 on a startup, no matter what the student debt load was right out of school. And so people would be $1 million in debt before they saw patient one. And even in those scenarios, the default rate was below 1%, right? And so anyway, so if I look at that, can you work on it by doing a startup? Absolutely, right? Can you end up doing buying a practice? Absolutely. What I would tell you is this. My tip would be, don't just look at one. Right? Don't just get sold on your very first one, right? So get your comps together, right? So whether there's local brokers within that market, national brokers, whoever it is, right? Talk to quite a few of them, right? And kind of see what different practices they represent. So start to understand what looking through a prospectus, looking through an appraisal looks like,
Amazing advice, especially the part about the team. I always like to remind myself of my failed dreams, Kyle, next to me. So you want to be a professional NBA basketball player. But when you grow to this height, you got to get new dreams. But team is such a key. How about this? So sometimes brokers behave badly, right? So I'm a dentist and a broker. And to be a dentist, I had to go to dental school and I'd pass licensing exams and I'd fill out a lot of stuff. There's many people, and I'm part of it. I've got dentists that broker with our company. You're a broker. So when there's low barrier to entry to fields, sometimes you see operators inside of the field not behaving well. Let me explain. When I wanted to buy a third practice, one of the brokers who went by first name only in our area tried to sell me a practice that wasn't for sale. It really messed with my emotions. He said, I got one for you. So what are some either bad behavior to note from brokers, things to watch out for? If you went to the dentist and they said you needed 28 crowns tomorrow, Kyle, I hope you would contact me and say, does that sound right, Paul? And I'd say, it's not impossible, Kyle. It's unlikely you need 28 crowns. Let me look at your x-rays. Let me look at your perio charting. Let me look at these things. So what are some just either best practices to kind of check in on brokers from your perspective?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've also, I work primarily in the dental field, but I have a couple other verticals within medicine. And one of the ideas in one of those fields is what's called a curbside consults, right? Where you end up talking with a different specialty within medicine, right? And what I would tell you is going to be, if somebody sends you an appraisal, right? Somebody sends you a breakdown of what this practice looks like. First of all, I probably trust that is going to be for sale. That's a crazy story. But a second thing from that is going to be, okay, tap into your advisors, right? And if it's maybe not even your advisors, ask another broker, hey, what are you thinking about this, right? And if nothing else, you're checking what they're thinking about that specific practice and how is it that they're talking about it, right? Or are they just looking to sell you something, or are they actually looking out for kind of the way that you might be thinking about it? I would also say that there's a way of thinking about this that I'm very surprised that fewer first-time buyers don't use an advisor, a buy-side broker, right?
Right.
That is not something that we do personally, right? We end up referring
Yeah.
those to other folks. But I'm surprised that not nearly as many do, because I would want somebody in your corner just telling you the real.
It's like a caddy in golf, right? If you play this tough golf course and your friend is a caddy and you don't have a caddy, you now can't even say, what's this shot like? What happens here? I don't ski, but I have a sense that skiing, if I say this, and this is the biggest decision of your life. It's funny, I gave the ASDA keynote at OSU. It was so much fun, Kyle. And some dentists go, I'm a D2. I want to buy 5 practices. I go, how about you start with one job, right? One job. And I like your enthusiasm, but if you mess up your one job, your morale, if you mess up your first practice, it can just be so brutal for your morale and money. I'm going to just want to check in with my audience, talking to my awesome friend, Kyle Francis, broker, founder of Professional Transition Strategies. Now, Kyle, you met me a few years ago. You come to Philadelphia. I would love, you've kind of noticed something about this Nacho audience. We're here as 2 brokers. We're not fighting. I always say dentists should collaborate more. Brokers should collaborate more. What have you enjoyed about the Dental Nachos sort of world? You found it interesting as a non-dentist. Tell our audience a little bit about that.
Very much so. So I mean, but first and foremost, the thing that stood out to me was the very first time that you let me onto the platform, I saw JBN, right? And so I was just like, okay, that resonates with the way that I'm thinking about things, and that you can help each other out, right? That there is a place to go where questions can get answered. And that doesn't mean you're going to like every single answer that's out there, right? But it means that you're going to get different opinions, right? So essentially kind of group sourcing the different types of questions that you end up having. I also really like the collaboration, right? So if I end up looking at, not just you, but there's a whole bunch of folks that have been sponsors and different folks that I've met through you as well. Yeah. Some of them become good friends of mine, and the people I refer to, and people that I think can help out folks, right? And so in total, I consider it, I guess, a really collaborative group. And then I would also consider it a really supportive group as well, which again, I think that's unique.
I appreciate that. I mean, I was just speaking to the Seattle Study Class saying, we always be connecting to feel less alone. And no matter what you do attached to the dental space, it can be a lonely field, whether you're traveling, whether you're operator by yourself. But when you can, I do encourage people to go to face-to-face events. But when you can pick up your phone and just get some answers, get somebody to say, oh yeah, that happened to me too. I just think that's magical for people in a world where sometimes you can just feel isolated. Well, thanks.
There's a guy down in Arkansas who I think said it the best. He's like, dentistry is hard, right? This is a dentist. His industry is hard. He's like, you have to have people around that can support you, right? And it's like, this has helped a fair amount of folks, I believe. So
when I say it's like being the parent of a 4-year-old for the rest of your life owning a dental practice, right? The good, the bad, the good, the challenging. What states do you guys not sell practices in, Kyle? That would be the best way to kind of. What states do you guys not sell practices in?
Well, so we've now sold practices in 47 states, which is exciting.
Awesome.
And the only reason that we haven't sold those 3 just because of population base. So there's only a matter of time until we get there.
Awesome.
We do not work in Canada or outside of the US in total, but anywhere in the US, we can work with you.
And this is the ultimate collaboration. I'm a broker too. Our broker firm represents some states, but people come to us and say, hey, can you help me in Arizona? I say, hey, I cannot do that. And we don't have the bandwidth. There are sometimes real estate licensing issues that go with this. So you're an awesome friend to us, Kyle. How could people, if they just wanted a question, reach out to you in any way, ask you about any of the things you talked about, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so probably just email info@professionaltransition.com. So I mean, that's probably the easiest way. So both of them are singular, professionaltransition.com. Otherwise, just go on our website, Professional Transition. There's a whole bunch of ebooks there, right? So if you just want to be a learner, right, just go on there and just kind of start stuffing your brain full of knowledge. So
awesome. If you need to reach out to us, you can do so at dentalnachos.com. We have so many free resources. If you're looking to buy or sell practice, just text buy or sell to 215-543-6454 or visit dentalnachos.com. Thanks so much, Kyle.